You are listening to I Am Refocused Radio with your host, Shamaya Reed. This show is designed to inspire you to live your purpose and regain your focus. And now, here's your host, Shamaya Reed.
Hey, welcome to I Am Refocused Radio. We are here once again today. Man, we are blessed to have a true amazing guest today. Man, he's an author, a trainer, a thought leader, and activist, Michael Fosberg. He has an amazing website that you can check out, Incognito.com. And man, right on the homepage, he has a little demo teaser that you can watch. I highly suggest you watch it because not only will you learn a lot of things, but you also get his comedian side, if you will. But man, first and foremost, welcome to the show, Michael. How you doing, man?
Thanks, Jim. I am doing really great. Thanks for having me.
So, man, appreciate you being on. This is an awesome story because all this humor, all this deep thought processing, and all this, authorship and everything, it stems from a story, man. And if you can, kind of give us, the audience, that story and that amazing phone call you had.
Yeah, sure. So I'll give you a little background. I was raised in a working class white family in the northern suburbs of Chicago, a little town called Waukegan. And I was raised by my biological mother, who was Armenian, and an adoptive stepfather who was Swedish. And they had a couple of kids when I was I'm 8 and 9 years older than my half brother and half sister, but it was really when I was in my early 30s that my parents announced that they were getting a divorce, and I realized that they had never told me anything about my biological father. All I knew was that we had left him when I was very young, and that my mother had never spoken about him again. I mean, I was 2 years old or so when she left him, and I was 5 when they remarried, and when she remarried. And so she never bothered to tell me anything about him. And so the divorce sort of threw me out into the world, and like, well, wait a minute, who's my biological father? So at the time I had this British girlfriend, and she suggested that I needed to ask my mother some questions. And so I called my mother and I asked her a few questions about, who's my biological father. And she told me his name was John Sidney Woods. And she told me that, the last time she had spoken to him was some 30 years ago, and she thought he lived in the Detroit area. So, and that was kind of it, a few more little odds and ends, but nothing really significant. And so I got off the phone. I decided I was going to search for him. And I lived in Santa Monica, California at the time. And I don't know if listeners will remember this, but libraries used to have this thing called phone books, which was where you would look someone's number up. Now you just go to the internet. We're so used to it. And so I went and they had a Detroit phone book in the reference section in the library. And I looked up his name, John Sidney Woods, and there were a few entries that matched that. So I wrote them down, and I went home, and I was, so nervous. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know what to say. Who knew that any of these names were going to be my dad? And so I just finally gathered the courage, and I picked up the phone, and I dialed the first number on the list. And a guy answers the phone, and I remember just being so nervous. I just said, I'm looking for John Sidney Woods. And he kind of paused, and he said, "You're speaking with him." And I said, "Oh, okay. Well, I was just wondering if you lived in the Boston area in 1957, because that's where my mother and I lived. That's where she lived, where she got pregnant and had me." And he kind of paused again, and he said, "Yeah, I did." And I said, "Were you married to a woman by the name of Adrian Pilibosian?" That was my mother's Armenian maiden name. And he paused again. It seemed like it was an hour. And he said, "Yes, I was." And I realized I'd tracked my dad down on the first phone call. And I said, "Oh my God, my name is Michael Fosberg, and I'm your son." And, we were both really nervous. I could feel his nervousness on the other end of the line. And I was just, shaking and, we're trying to talk to one another. It's been 30 years since we talked to each other. And so, I'm trying to piece things out. You're my dad, I'm your son. How do we move forward? And then sort of out of the blue, he says to me, son, there's a couple of things you should know. I'm sure your mother's never told you. And I was like, okay, aside from not telling me about you, I mean, what could that be? And he says, well, first of all, I want you to know that I've always loved you and I've thought about you a lot. And I was just just like, this is my dad telling me he loved me, like, for the first time. And I was just beside myself. And then he said, there's one other thing I'm sure your mother's never told you. And I said, what? And he said, I'm African American. And, I grew up in a white working class family thinking I was a white guy, and here I was hearing from my biological father that I'm a lot more than that now. And then he started to tell me about my family history dating all the way back to slavery. My great grandfather was a member of the 54th Regiment in the Colored Infantry Unit in the Civil War. My grandfather was my great grandfather was an all-star pitcher in the Negro Leagues. He pitched for the St. Louis Stars. And my grandfather was a genius in the science and engineering departments at Norfolk State University, which is an HBC. The science building is named after him. And I'm telling you, like, I was just dumbfounded. I didn't even know what to say. I was just, I didn't know what to say. And we swore that we'd stay in touch. And, I took his phone number. He took mine. We got off the phone, and that was the beginning of my journey.
I mean, did you feel like you hit the jackpot? Because it could have been another situation. I mean, how did you feel after that phone call?
I hit the black jackpot. Yeah. I mean, I have to tell you, Shemaiah, a lot of people have said to me, well, were you ashamed when you first heard this news, or how did it make you feel? Did you not want to hear this news? I have to say, all my life, I guess I had felt sort of this absence of something, and I'd also felt this deep connection to African American people, African American culture. And I couldn't explain why. There was nothing about me or my family that suggested I was anything but what they were. I mean, I know I didn't know who my biological father was, but it never occurred to me that my biological father could be black. And I think part of that is because I grew up, your listeners can't see me, but I grew up with white privilege. I have very, very light skin. I walk around in the world today and I pass. It's not like I'm trying to pass. It's just what I was born with. And so, again, not knowing who my biological father was and not even thinking that he could be black is kind of like part of my white privilege. And what hearing all this news and taking it all in, and then meeting my family shortly after I had that phone call, and them embracing me, and then hearing all the history and meeting all these different family members was just an amazing experience and really joyous. And it just really filled my life.
Once again, listen on Refocus Radio, talking to our guest, Michael Fosberg. You can go to his website, incognitotheplay.com. And that was really going to be my next question. I mean, were you sharing with people like, hey, by the way, I'm black, I just learned this? Like, were you like on this kind of phase of telling people who you are? And if so, how did people outside your family receive that news?
Yeah, I mean, it's a strange, in some ways, it's a strange place to be, because it's, again, if listeners could see me, and you can go to the website and see it, but I pass, I look white everywhere I've gone for most of my life. No one is, I mean, I will say there have been a lot of people of color, a lot of black people who have, done a double take or said to me, oh, you must have some black in you, or whatever, like I jokingly refer to it as blackdar. People have blackdar, like they speak about, you can tell a gay person you have gaydar. Well, people have blackdar. And I've had people, pick me out and go, oh yeah, I know your story. And even my cousin, I have a black cousin who Cheryl, and when I met her and we went out to a restaurant, and it was in Jersey City, and we were sitting at this restaurant, and she points at a table of white people across the room, and she points at a guy at the table, a white guy, and she says, he don't know. And I'm like, what are you talking about? He don't know. He goes, he's black and he don't know. And I was like, oh my God, like, how can you tell? What is it about a person, that you can tell these things? So, like as I started to tell the story to people, and people were, I got all kinds of reactions. People were shocked and people were delighted and people embraced me, both black and white, friends and new friends and all of that. And so it was a really amazing thing. And then it turned into this thing that we're sort of here to talk about a little bit. Is it turned into a one-man play. And I started to share the story, telling the story as I just told it to listeners today, playing all the different parts. I play over a dozen different characters. And then I tell this story in about 45 minutes. And then I facilitate a dialogue about race and identity. And so I'm trying to get people to open up and talk about how we look at ourselves, how we see ourselves, and how we look at other people. And what is race? And how do we go about discussing it? Or as is most often the case, not discussing it.
And you now, when you speed up to today, you spoke to many different platforms since 2005, including law firms, corporations, schools, colleges, government agencies. I mean, did you have any kind of gut feeling that this could turn into a huge opportunity for you to have a platform to speak to people?
Not at all. I hadn't an inkling. I seriously, I was an actor when I started this journey. I was an actor, a miserably unemployed actor in Los Angeles, and I just took the skills that I had and turned it into this play. But I didn't foresee what happened after that. And as you've sort of laid out, what happened after that is, once I started to perform the play and then to facilitate these conversations, these deep and meaningful conversations, people started to reach out to me, like, would you come to my high school? Would you come to my college? Would you come to my corporation? Would you come? I've done shows at the Department of Treasury. I've done shows for the Department of Homeland Security, for the Social Security Administration, for corporations like Boeing and Proctor Gamble and Wells Fargo. And it's crazy. It's absolutely crazy. And I never set out to do that. I never set out thinking, oh my gosh, this is what's going to happen. I know where I'm going with this. It just kept growing and growing. And as I kept going along the journey, I was learning more and more about how to talk about these issues and how to open up the door and help other people talk about these issues so that we could have something really meaningful and something that could help evolve us and change the course of the way, again, that we see ourselves and the way that we look at other people.
And how has your mom reacted to all of these speaking events and recognition in a positive way? I mean, it's a very positive situation.
Yeah. So initially, when I found out all of this information about my life and about what had happened with my father and stuff, and I came to a realization that my mother had lied to me, that she didn't tell me the information, and that she had kept it secret my entire life. And I was initially extremely angry about it. I felt betrayed. And it actually, in the play, I tell this little story. I get a phone call from a friend of mine, Tommy, who I tell him the news, and he says to me, he says, I always knew you were black. And I'm like, how he knew this, is beyond me, but he wasn't the only one. And so then I tell him about my anger towards my mother, and he says, no, don't you see, you have an opportunity to help absolve your mother of the shame and guilt she has felt all your life. She was just trying to help raise you. She didn't know what to do. She was disowned by her family. And you now have an opportunity to help her let that go, let that shame and guilt go. And I realized it was an opportunity to forgive my mom. And so I went back to her and I talked to her about it and forgave her. And today we have an incredible relationship, and she's very, very proud of the work that I do. And there are occasions when she's a little, timid about, oh gosh, you're telling that story again, and she's a little, I guess I would say, ashamed that she wasn't forthcoming with the information. But she's very, very proud that I'm out there every day trying to get people to have some really, really important conversations. And it's really helped our relationship.
Sometimes it's important to be uncomfortable in certain situations, man. And that's an understatement to what you've been able to do and do it in such a way that is a positive light. And we really need that in today's times. When you look at the opportunities that you've been able to educate people, because this is an education thing too, where we're taking a different perspective of a situation, and we're kind of allowing people to look through a certain lens that they may never seen before or took time to notice. What's it like to be in that process where you're using your platform to educate people for not just inclusion and diversity, but just human being? Like, we're not that far different from each other.
Yeah, well, you just said it right there. We have more in common than we have different. That's, if anything, that's my main focus and message, is that we have more in common than different, and yet we allow the differences to separate us. And so, what does it feel like? I guess I'm gonna tell you, it's in a word, incredible. It's an honor. It's a blessing. I recently did some work for a church in Knoxville, Tennessee, an Episcopal church. And I performed the show in the church a couple of times. We had a couple hundred people at each presentation. And then it received such an overwhelming response that the church, along with a couple of other entities in Knoxville, partnered up and sponsored me to come back to Knoxville and perform it in the Bijou Theater downtown, 750-seat theater. And it's such a big story, and it's more than kind of, as you said, like and yes, it does definitely deal with race and identity, but it deals with more about humanity. And again, I didn't plan that. That wasn't the plan. It was just, I wanted to tell the story. I thought it was an interesting story. And then when I started to see the response to it, I started to realize how much it could be helpful to people. And so I feel like many biracial people, I guess, that I'm in a blessed position. I feel it's an honor to be in this position. I get to help to be a bridge to help people cross race, cross ethnicity, cross nationality, cross differences. I get to be that bridge to help bring people across and meet. And I don't take that lightly. It's a really important thing. And I feel, again, really, really blessed and honored to be in that position.
I feel like sometimes these conversations, and depends on the setting, but sometimes it can be like a tug of war. Like, okay, you pick this side, and then okay, y'all pick this side, the other side. Was it like, not was it like, but what some tips do you have for people to have these kind of uncomfortable conversations based on race, and how we can look past the typical, like, okay, let's all get ready for Black History Month, type of speech?
Right. Right. Well, you've said quite a few of them here. I mean, just get over this uncomfortable conversation. I have 7 tools that I use to help people have more meaningful conversations, and one of the tools is get comfortable being uncomfortable. And I know that sounds crazy to people. Like when I mention that, they're like, "Why would I want to get comfortable being uncomfortable? That's kind of crazy." But the fact is that we're probably uncomfortable at some moment throughout the course of every day of our lives, and yet we work through it. And so what I'm suggesting is that we need to do the same with this topic, with the topic of race, identity, people, humanity, whatever. We need to get comfortable being uncomfortable. And the first tool, though, is an obvious one too. And we talked a little bit about this, is tell your story. It's through our stories that we discover our commonalities. So it's an academic theory called intergroup contact theory. And intergroup contact theory is a proven theory that states that by sharing our personal stories across majority and minority populations, we can break down the prejudices that exist between us by discovering we have more in common than we have different. That's a fact. And so that's the first tool, maybe the most obvious. And then don't judge the differences. I mean, flip the script. Instead of allowing a difference to separate us, start by, again, finding a common interest and then embrace the differences. After all, if we were all the same, we'd be bored. We all like to have the coolest thing, or the whatever the latest thing is, or the coolest individual thing that makes us individual. And yet we all want to fit in. And so, find those commonalities and then embrace the differences and recognize that there isn't one way to have this conversation. I mean, some people, look, I've been in rooms where, I've told my story and people have been overwhelmed and just inspired. But I've also noticed that there have been some people who've walked out of the room feeling like, oh, that was a waste of my time, or I didn't agree what he had to say, or whatever it might be. We're not all going to agree on what's the best method to go about having these difficult conversations. And that's okay. Just know that it's going to be a little messy. And then I guess I would say, it's important for us to recognize other people's realities. Just because we haven't experienced racism or sexism or homophobia or age discrimination or disability indifference or some other form of discriminatory treatment doesn't mean that those are not realities for other people. So we need to open up, listen, and be empathetic. And so those are some of the things that I would advise listeners to use when they're trying to embark on these conversations.
Those are some good points right there. And you also you give e-learning platform. You also can work with organizations for interactive workshops. If you can, for our audience, let us know if you still do those and how can they connect with you if they're interested, organizations interested in inviting you for the opportunity there.
Yes. So I still do all of that. The e-learning platform, which is what people are commonly are given training for at different companies. All companies do some kinds of training, whether it's training about what we call diversity, equity, and inclusion, or it's other kinds of training, leadership training, or whatever it might be. Lots of companies do it online. And so one of the complaints that I hear from people all the time, especially about diversity, equity, and inclusion training, is that, oh, it's so boring and it's a waste of time. It's dry, it's whatever. And so I decided to create a platform, online platform that people could use that utilized my play. So it's a live recorded tape of the play. And then it's broken up into 5 sections, and then they have learnings with each of those sections as well. And so that's one way to go about doing online training that's a little more exciting and a little less dry than the standard traditional form. And then I do lots of workshops, interactive workshops, where either I'll come in and, first do the play and conduct the dialogue, and then come in a second time, a third time, a fourth time, and do a variety of different exercises in which we all explore who we are and how we respond to one another. And they're fun, they're engaging, they're not, like in your face or anything like that. And it really gets people engaged and listening. Very important to listen and to ask questions. And so I do those things both for, again, corporations, government agencies, law firms, realtor associations, all different kinds of places.
We've been talking to our guest, Michael Fosberg, and go to his website, Incognito.com. Man, time's always going by when you're having a good conversation. But before we close, what's a good call to action for listeners or someone who's part of an organization that would like to be in touch with you?
Well, if anyone wants to get in touch with me for whatever reason, just they're curious, you can reach me through the website. And thank you for repeating it, incognitotheplay.com. You can reach me there. You can find out more information about all the offerings and all the different things that I do. I have 2 books. You can buy the books at the website. The first book was the memoir, Incognito, An American Odyssey of Race and Self-Discovery. And the second book is Nobody Wants to Talk About It, Race, Identity, and the Difficulties in Forging Meaningful Conversations. You can get those there. But the thing that I think that I would express to leave listeners with today would be silence gives consent. When you hear something or see something that is racist or inappropriate or sexist or homophobic or whatever it might be, speak up. It's by being silent that we are now complicit in whatever took place. And so we need to speak up. And I'm going to encourage people to not only speak up, but to speak up from a respectful place. Like if I know what happens to me, like I see something and it triggers anger in me, and I want to say something, and sometimes what I'll say will come out angry or, right at someone's face. Instead, I need to take a deep breath and be respectful and let someone know that whatever they're saying or whatever they're doing makes me feel uncomfortable. And have you thought about the consequences of the language that you're using or the actions that you're taking? And so speak up. Don't be silent.